and about, so I'm just been notified that the meeting's being recorded. 3 days after that good news, I got a phone call from the university health offices informing me that I had a malignant melanoma, and particularly nasty kind of cancer that they didn't have the kinds of treatments they actually now have developed for. So birth and death were kind of superimposed on one another in a particularly striking way at that point in my life. I was also a junior faculty member at the university, and teaching and juggling these other things. So the book is in the shape of a kind of diary of a bad year, with divided into 3 sections: a fall term, a winter term, and a spring term, with a brief coda called summer, and adopts various forms of and modes for telling the story of that year in my life. It's also, I guess I should say before proceeding, that although the book doesn't end necessarily with a happy or a sad ending, my own story so far has turned out fairly well. I'm out of the blue with my cancer diagnosis. I've been surgically treated, and I'm doing okay. So no need to fear on that front. So now I'm going to try a little something where that I'm sure is going to crash my computer. I'm going to share my screen with you and read a handful of what I think of as pop quizzes from hell that kind of appear throughout the book. And so I'll let you see them as well. Let me see if this will work. And then after that, Lauren and I will chat for about 15-20 minutes, and we'll also, I'll be happy to answer questions from you all, which you can enter into the chat, as Jesse said. So let's see if I can share my screen here. And begin. These are galleys from the book. 14. Please print clearly and remember your name. 1. The river of fire in ancient Greek thanatopography feeds into the river of blank. 2. From the river of pain spring 2 rivers, the river of blank and the river of blank. 3. The river of blank runs a separate course entirely, concealed inside the Greek word for truth. 4. At the sight of sinners approaching, the blank seethes like butter in a frying pan. 5. Blank is the Sanskrit river of ash. 6. As the sun god Ra floats down the river of the hidden chamber, his head is exchanged for that of a blank. 7. Those for whom much lamentation is made find the blank swollen with tears and difficult to cross. 8. To our knowledge, the river of blank has no name. 23. Read each question and circle the least incorrect option. Remain quietly seated when you are done. 1. The entrance to the Mayan underworld is located in blank. A. An underwater cave system in Bolivia. B. The dark rift in the Milky Way. C. A locked vault in the back office of the United Fruit Company. D. All of the above. 2. The sun god Ra journeys through the 3rd hour of the night on A. Funeral boat. B. Serpent boat. C. One-eyed boat. D. Boat towed by jackals. 3. The hero's companion in the Epic of Gilgamesh dies of A, vehicle rollover, B, friendly fire, C, superficial spreading malignant melanoma, D, irrelevant question. 4. The first large-scale multiple choice assessment was administered by A, the Hindu god of death, B, Jacques Derrida, C, the United States Army, D, all of the below. 11. Please limit your responses to the space-time provided below. Your answers will be evaluated for honesty, cleanliness, devotion, humility, compassion, and spelling. No talking, 10 minutes. 1. Enumerate the principal mountain ranges of the late Bronze Age Sumerian realm of the dead. 2. Identify he who consumes the excrement from his hindquarters. 3. Briefly trace the development of data storage systems from the Underworld ledger to cloud computing. 4. What is the function of repetition in disciplining the dead? 4. What is the function of repetition in disciplining the dead? 16. This one is, the test forms start to take on different arrangements, and this is one of those like connect the columns, items in different columns. Draw a line from each divinity to his or her or their least incorrect identification. There's no earthly penalty for guessing. 10 minutes, no talking. Inuit death god, sleeps on a sickbed. Celtic death god, man with something to cut. Hindu death god, subsists on a diet of stars. Aztec death god, hangs sister from meat hook. Sumerian death goddess, wears a cloak made of mist. Incan death god, nationalizes mining industry. Japanese death goddess, body of stone. Egyptian death god, penis eaten by catfish. Norse death goddess, composer of invitations. Ohlone death god, never lies. 19. I have no idea how to really read this one, but you'll get the idea. Locate the underworld figures hidden below. You may search the 4 cardinal directions, diagonally and in reverse. Please, no talking. Hurry. Yomra, Jikininki, Batarakala, Izanami no Mikoto, Mitlantle Kutli, Mot, Kernabog, Blue Material, Ogbunabali, Ha. They're all in there somewhere. 7. Circle the correct companion species to escort the dead through their underworlds. No talking. No looking over your shoulder. Objects in learning assessment are closer than they appear. 1. Late classic Mesoamerica. If I remember correctly, it's this guy. 2. Arab Republic of Egypt. 3. Inuit, Aleut, Inupiat, Yupik. This is an Aurora Borealis. 4. Yangtze River Valley, 5th millennium AD. 28. This one features some a pain scale. Rate the following exercises on the scale below. 0 feels nothing at all. 5 hurts as much as you can imagine. You don't have to actually be crying to feel this way. 1. Contemplate your moral form in the Jade Emperor's mirror. 2. Dig through a hillside with your breasts wearing a millstone for a cap. No bathroom, no sleeping. Hurry up, please. These are all actual underworld punishments from different cultures. 3, masturbate forever, chanting, I'm alone in Middle Persian. 4, be thou a deathless thorn tree in the suicidal woods. 5, shit forever. 6, hold up the sky. So I think I'll stop there. Probably should have provided an answer key.
Oh, no,
But
no, 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 no.
you know, I've actually forgotten most of the answers, Lauren.
Well, I'm glad to hear it because, you know, my relation to the quizzes, I mean, you do say at the beginning of the book, on page 60, you say the world of the dead is crammed full of tests. So the relation between, so it's a really important thing about the book. This is not really what I wanted to say in response to what you just said, but well, actually, it's not irrelevant to, I'm going to just try to do like a rough segue here. It's not irrelevant to what we're going to be talking about, which is what happens when you discover yourself in the middle of something. Okay. So I was going to say, when I first started reading this book, I was like, oh, Jesus, I'm going to have to look up every other word, you know, and I was like being a scholar and I was like reading it at my desk and I was using, you know, just trying to get it right. Okay. But of course, what you say in the book about translation is you can't get it right. You just want to get it wrong in the right way. And so the idea of actually being able to master the quiz, it seems to me, is you know, I don't want to say you've misread your own book, but it doesn't solve the problem of living to know these answers, you know. And that, you know, one of the things you're satirizing is people's desire to make knowledge power in a way that they can feel immediately and not have to feel that, you know, once they know something, they have no more power over anything but the answer they have than they had before they knew it, you know. So I'm just saying, okay, well, like, so Jessie said in the beginning, I don't really want to disagree with her, but she said in the beginning, this is a Dantesque journey. And the reason she said this was because you find yourself in the middle of life. And the thing is, when you're in a genre of the middle, you don't know what the edges are. You don't know what the genre is going to be. You only know you're having an episode. And so just like these interruptions are themselves a kind of dilation of the middle. What are we doing here? What are we saying here? What do we want to have happen? Can we like wrestle it back into the form we knew that we were going to have? Is there something about trying to control a space that's fundamentally dynamic in the encounter among humans and histories? And, you know, there's a lot of that. This kind of interruption is the kind of interruption that a cancer diagnosis is too, because in the book, because so on page 9, you finally make the phone call to Dr. Song, just in case we needed to think this had something to do with poetry.
Right.
And you start to dissociate. So between the power, you know, the dissociation goes throughout this book. You know, I have affinity with the living, with the unliving and the undead. You know, here between the first 2 paragraphs, it's hard to say how long I stood there listening. It may have been seconds or seasons. There is this dilation of time that becomes the like attack of the past on the present, but also you don't want to be in the present. The you of the book doesn't want to be in the present. It's actually not in the present. And what it is being sucked back into all of these like bizarre causalities and stuff like that. So, you know, this is just my way of saying, one of the great things about this book is its patience with being in the middle and understanding that the middle isn't a space of confidence at all, but a kind of non-place that people are trying to find their footing in. And Chen, your kind of alter ego, you know, who's trying to figure, Chen is always finding out about his past lives, right? So he's not in the present either. His present is like a phantasm in front of him that he discovers he's not in control over. So it's this kind of he's on a beam of histories. And there are a number of times when he's sentenced to hearing what his history was. Okay, A, you know, and B, there is also a page where we read your case history. So this whole proliferation of histories as a definition of what it means to be in the middle of a disruption in the continuity of the body. I don't know, I thought that was kind of amazing. So do you want to take back what you said about having to know all the answers? Like think about it as thematized or something?
Yeah, no, that's so wonderful, Lauren. And you know, I mean, I think the question of the middle is something that I actually wrestled with a lot in the writing of the book. Because in the end, I think one thing I wanted to do was to think about the descent into the underworld, right? That occurs kind of in the midpoint of most of the epic poems that I was teaching actually at the time in the in our core course on readings in world literature. And there was something that obviously, because I was going through a crisis at the time, drew me to those passages of descent and catabasis. And yet the experience of kind of emerging from the underworld triumphantly and heroically felt so completely unimaginable to me that I wanted to kind of turn that structure inside out and write a book that was all underworld without the stuff before the descent and after the descent. And that actually became a formal problem in a lot of ways, because how do you write a book that's kind of all middle? You have to have a beginning and an end, and yet crisis felt like something that had no beginning or end, right? That was just middle. And I think this kind of goes beyond the personal experience I was having. I kept returning to the famous beginning of Dante's Inferno. In the middle of life, I found myself lost in a forest of shadows. And there's kind of great website. It's called the Princeton Dante Project, where you can read all of Dante with hundreds of years of commentary on every line of the poem by these generations of Italian and European and American scholars. And one thing that struck me in the footnotes to the first line of the poem was that it's not in the middle of my life I found myself lost in a forest of shadows. It's in the middle of life. And Dante viewed himself as actually being in the middle of the history of life on the planet. His kind of eschatology timeline was such that he was exactly between the creation of the world and the final judgment. So I think that there's something about the middleness of one's own experience, one's own crisis, and also I think of world history where we find ourselves, that came together in the writing of the book that took this form of middleness, that I don't know if I really do find my way out of by the end of the book. In some ways, I think I feel like I find myself kind of writing a circular book as a result.
Well, I kind of have a different view about that, but I don't know if but I'm not sure going to the end is the thing we would want to do now, because there's so much on the way to it. But what
Sure.
happens at the end isn't what happens to you, but what happens to Chen. Mm-hmm. Chen is sentenced to come back as a girl, and so, which is to say, Chen, and then someone says to Chen, okay, let me show you what your future is going to be like. And Chen has nervous breakdown. Okay. Right. Okay. And his family says you were dead to the world, for the rest of the day. And then what Chen remembers are precepts that are on the wall of the historical space that by fainting he's left. So thinking about coming to consciousness as a form of departure, mm-hmm. Which is one way of thinking about the way the book uses dissociation, I think would be really super interesting. But also that, he thinks because he can't imagine being a girl, being a girl is too much for him, and being a girl is a figure of the future. But in this book, the women, by which I mean Mira, so maybe not women, girls, and Suzanne too, they are the people who know how to occupy the present.
Right. That's great. Yeah.
And so in a way, I think you write the book that you're finally welcoming the present.
Right, right. Well, maybe I should say a word about this Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I should say a word about this character of Chen who appears in the book.
Yeah, that would be
Um,
good.
in addition to my own kind of story of the year, the narrator of the poem begins to translate old Chinese tale. Uh, he doesn't know Chinese, but he finds a French translation of it. So and he barely knows French. So the tale is a story of minor Chinese scholar official named Chen, who's called down to the underworld to answer for some war crimes committed centuries before his birth. And
And
that story,
war crimes that he didn't commit, but he wrote a memo advising against them. So it's also about kind of bureaucratic, like minoritized, right? I don't mean minor, like ridiculous bureaucratic agency compared to the agency of generals in war.
right. And of course, I started translating this story while the U.S. was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and seemed to be in the middle of those, and in the endless middles of those invasions. Um, so, so this character of Chen is ultimately called. The translation goes off rails, and Chen has to travel through, take detours through various underworlds of different cultures, including the ancient Mayan and the ancient Egyptian underworlds. Even as I say this aloud, I find myself feeling embarrassed at the zaniness of the story. And then he finds his way to the underworld of late imperial China. And he's sentenced in a kind of kangaroo court um, to be reborn as a girl, which is actually a literal translation of the original Chinese tale. So that kind of dreadful punishment kind of resolves Chen's legal narrative. And I do think you're right, Lauren. I'm so glad that you observed that gender is a part of this story, and I think that the dissociation is was very much my own response to my cancer diagnosis, and to frankly probably to news of war and basically all of the bad news that I received at various points in my life, and that I think that the splitting off of my own kind of identity into a kind of what could I think be read as a brown person doing yellowface in some ways. This translation where there's a character named Chen who has a kind of allegorical adventure that in some ways reflects my own struggles at the time. That dissociation, I think in some ways the rebirth as a girl to me from the original story, the original Chinese tale, felt actually redemptive rather than like a punishment.
And also it meant you could be in the same space with the other people who know how to be in the present, and that the present is a place where death is an accompaniment of living rather than the end of it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's scenes in the book about watching my spouse and daughter grow, not just the child growing, but the adult growing as well, from my study window or, from afar, that I think was very much part of my response to illness, was to really kind of step back in lots of ways. I think the book
They are
is
like full of love for things. Like I love this and I love that, and I'm going to make a catalog of more things I love, and I can't wait to attach to more objects and stuff. And
right.
I thought it would be really interesting, just formally and kind of typographically, to think about the relation between the Rorschach plot and the translations, because it seemed to me that and also and your scan, which we
Mm-hmm.
also see, so that there are these blotches on the page that are
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be revelatory in the way you read them, right? And then you say at some point, there is only one dream, there is only one card. I wonder if you could just think about, the incitement to be in the room with an enigma that knowledge can't really clarify because you're an N of one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's another important through line of this book that's kind of maybe overstuffed with various through lines. And um, what, this through line kind of developed just from this kind of horrified act of staring at my own tumor, at the actual mole that had developed into cancer, and it looked like nothing so much as a Rorschach blot. And you find yourself, staring at something, trying to figure out what it is. And my physicians also didn't really know what it was at the time. There's a lot of scrutiny and kind of almost hermeneutic kind of activity brought to bear on this thing that, if it had form, would mean I was safe, right? If it had a clear perimeter, if it had certain features, it would be, oh, it's just a mole. But precisely because of its shapelessness and inability to fall into a particular form, became something that was a kind of entrance to the underworld, right? And so the Rorschach blot, this kind of outdated psychological test, started to seem like a figure for thinking about the ways that different people can view the same version of like the real, this like, thing that eludes formalization, and view it as so many different things. The war, a lesion, um, any number of things. And so that became a kind of place for me to start thinking about likeness and comparison, and other issues that kind of reverberate throughout the book. Yeah.
I think also
Mhm.
because when you get to the final, what you call the coda, uh, the block of Chinese writing that's on a bunch of pages before you get to the translation part, and then before, one of the things you're doing is you're actually not looking for clean margins. Your translation is a bleeding beyond the edge.
Right.
And that there would be another way of thinking about the blotchiness of this book and the use of the Rorschach in the book is as a kind of, there's a hope that you could know the answer, and that what got revealed would be like your best ethical, philosophical, historical self. But you understand at some level that it's just a prompt for a story that will bleed beyond its margin, and that the translation for you and the Rorschach as a kind of psychological fantasy of form that will never change its shape, the melanoma really changes your relation to form because of that, and because of your sense of how it generates an aesthetic space. No?
Right. Absolutely. And, I think in some ways, translation is another place where that question of, you know, the speaker of the book devises a kind of slightly absurd theory of translation that he calls projective translation. And he says that what he's doing is not, translation, but it's projective translation. And projective is the term that psychologists use to refer to the Rorschach assessment. It's a projective assessment because we project our readings onto it. So, I think that translation and also rebirth are places where questions of form and content get reiterated, in a kind of recursive way, where there's no one form that in, certain Asian belief systems, there's no one form that one actually does have a claim to, and that residence in one's present form is actually something that one should look beyond, look beyond the middle of, right, toward the next narrative iteration of it. So yeah, I think that I think what you say is really true, and that form and formlessness are kind of really central concerns of the book. And I do hope that I have a new relationship to form, to all kinds of forms, cultural forms, and political forms and literary forms now that I'm finished with it.
But also,
Definitely not going to write another book in that form again.
also like being able to be in the presence of an ongoingness
Mm-hmm.
rather than seeing whether you pass the test or not.
Right. Yeah. Well, so exam, assessment culture and exams and testing, which you mentioned earlier at the very beginning of our conversation, are very important to this book as well. And, largely because I was feeling very tested and probably testy at the time. But, it's also something that was so deeply informing my own, professional life, and that I've had a very awkward relationship to, because I oftentimes feel unqualified to administer the assessments that I'm administering to my students. And I think that this idea of the underworld, which is shared by so many different cultures as a place of testing after the fact of one's life, is one that I think came out. I think that's probably why I gravitated toward reading the quizzes at the beginning of this event. Those learning assessments kind of focalize a lot of questions having to do with form, knowledge, understanding, and the difficult politics or the different difficult ethics. I don't know what you would call it. The power structures of learning that we live in our whole lives, whether we're in school or not.
Well, you make a like satirical comment about being called under theorized, and like as though one is ever adequately theorized. You know what I mean? Like as though one is finished. I mean, there's just, it's the ongoing life of keeping the event of the thought open.
Absolutely.
Anyway, by now you wanted us to open up to questions.
Sure, we have some.
Tom Mitchell says, "Aren't we all in the middle right now?" Yes, we are. Okay. So Richard Stryer wants to know, what about the narrative? Where did the idea of the staircase as a character come from?
So so much of the book gets overtaken by this translation of a translation. And a lot of the ways in which this translation becomes more of a slapstick kind of tumble through the various underworlds is because of errors in translation. And early on, as I was translating this old Chinese tale from the French, I came across this word satellite in French, which recurs throughout as I think there's a figure that guides the figure of Chen through the underworld. And the actual meaning of satellite in this historical context was like spirit or something like that. But it's kind of outdated French. And now if you look up satellite in a French English dictionary, you'll get, among other things, motorized airport staircase. So that becomes the device that guides Chen through the underworld. And I think being guided by a mistake, I think not looking back, is probably what that was about. And actually, now that I think about it, probably true of life.
The staircase was my favorite character.
Yeah. Yeah.
I loved the staircase.
Thanks, Richard.
When its wheel fell off.
Yes. Yeah. So well, I won't give away what happens to the staircase, but this character Chen does develop a kind of a strong attachment to this talking motorized airport staircase.
Okay, so that's a fantastic question, Richard. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question, which is from Dan Rayburn. If Chicu wants to talk more about the hermit crab aspect of the book, in which he takes a pre-existing form of the questionnaire, but many other pre-existing forms, you could say too, for a literary purpose, I'd be interested.
That's a great, I mean, I never thought about the hermit crab school of literature, but that's probably suits me just right. Yeah, I think, in the way that I believe hermit crabs kind of encrust whatever forms are at hand, right? and it did feel like what began as kind of a straight up narrative poem that was just narrating my own kind of emotional and, you know, professional and um, uh, I guess you could say political difficulties during that particular time in my life, began to get layered on with I would find a student evaluation that was particularly funny in their assessment of my performance. And I'd say, well, I have to put this in. Or, you know, a course description might occur to me. And it seemed to me that, you know, rather than trying to narrativize or over narrativize those elements of one's life, including, you know, my own medical history, records and things, medical records and things like that, why not simply present them? And in some ways you could think of them as kind of being layered like a kind of shell. You know. And I think that obviously there's lots of precedent for other writers who've done this really beautifully. Claudia Rankine's book, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, was very important for me in thinking about that structure of the book. And many others, writings of Anne Carson and W.G. Sebald, lots of others. So I can't claim to have invented that hermit crab, but I copied from others in making it.
I think also there's this amazing passage on 67 where you say, you're thinking about misplacement rather than displacement, which I think is really interesting because in that part of the book, you're still hoping that you'll be able to find a slot that you could coast into rather than, you know, running into a wall and being picked up by a staircase. You know, there's a certain like Hogwartsness or something, you know. But anyway, and then you say, sadness is darkness in motion. Depression is darkness at rest. I felt neither here nor there, like a passenger quietly seated on a departing ferry who studies each fleck and flaw in the window's glass without looking through it for the duration of the crossing. And I thought that was so beautiful, a refusal of the crab shell, e.g. of you know, taking on somebody else's form, because it was also, you get to read the kind of crevices in the object. You don't have to use the window as a window. You could, you know, your focus is also producing a new object there. And I thought it would be almost impossible to represent except through some terrible camera work.
Yeah, it's funny. I think being, maybe there's something about the middleness of that moment in the book of looking not through the window, but at the window, the flaws in the window pane itself, and realizing that medium through which you are looking is actually there, right, and has its own history and its own distortions and damages. And I think that was in some ways a refusal of looking at myself reflected in the mirror, right, or in the window's glass, right, of the ferry, but also a way of kind of looking at the world. And I think that a lot of the book is, you know, as things like a translation takes over the story, and as the speaker of the story recedes to the background of his own story, I think that felt to me, now I'm wandering off topic here, but that felt to me like in some ways the story was the story of someone kind of receding into the background of what they viewed as their own life.
Right. Well, we could talk about that forever. I'm gonna not say what I think about that, but we have two more questions up here. The next one sort of follows from what we were just talking about. From Robin, she says she notices that your forms and quizzes include redactions, which is a theme of your other work too. Do you want to think about more out loud the applications of erasure and redaction in this book, and you know, distinguish it or not, because I think it's used very differently, although it is on the front page, you know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, in some ways I kind of feel like, right. And so the book I wrote before this was a book of literary erasures. And, like this book, I think I overdid it with that book. I erased the same book 3 times, and by the end of it was thoroughly, tired of, or wanted nothing to do with erasure ever again. And so I think in some ways the kind of maximalism of this book, which is another way of answering Dan's question about the hermit crab, kind of accretive structure. I think the maximalism of this book was an attempt to go as far away from the minimalism of erasure. Now, what motivates that kind of, bipolar relationship to, form? I don't know, but I think I was trying to, with the last book, get everything into a book through subtraction. And I think in this one, by adding in everything, that was the way. And including elements of redaction in that in that maximalist approach. So little bits of text are blocked out and blacked out that would disclose personal information in this book, but it's mostly parodic in this case.
Well, speaking of which, the next question, which has been seconded also, it's Lisa Olson and also Lucy Alford. There's a hilarious, from my perspective, but our tastes may vary, Obad on 118 that begins, "Dawn with her frosted pink fingernails raked away night's remains." And Lucy and Jesse and Lisa want to know, could you talk about your play with the style and language of epic? Could you say more about what you thought you were transforming or parodying from the world of the epic? And just sort of that particular hermit shell crab.
Yeah, so I think epic was really important in thinking about frameworks, and I wanted to tell the story of my own difficulties, at this period in life, but those difficulties were so refracted through questions of war and feelings of complicity and so on, that it was impossible for them not to be kind of pushed through epic form. Also because I was teaching epics at the time. And so, I think that one thing that the epic allows for is like the highest possible diction. And if you think about, any poem as, moving between these two registers, I think that the wanting to write a book of the middle means wanting to write a book that puts everything in, and trying to put everything in means trying to speak in as many to capture as many gradations of voice as you can. And so epic allowed for that kind of what felt like the richest possible musicality to coexist in a book where kind of ugly truths are also appearing.
That's fantastic.
I think.
Lucy responds to this by saying, especially with regard to parody as a method of intervention.
Right, because it's very hard to write songs of praise to the dawn, in modern English, with a straight face, for me at least. And I think that one kind of quite beautiful thing about parody is it lets you be utterly serious and flamboyant in your passions, because you're protected by parody as a arena for expressing those gestures. So I think that, one thing, I'm not sure that I would like to write another parody ever again, but I think one thing I learned about parody was that how deep the waters of parody can run.
Well, gosh, I have no idea what you mean by that.
I'm not sure I do either, but I think that, do you mean you think that parody is kind of necessarily kind of shuts itself off from?
No. I want to know what you what you mean by how deep you discovered how deep the waters are, which is
Mm,
to say something about that they let in all these different kinds of tone. The parody isn't a safe space with respect
mhm.
to the object, but in the sense of getting inside of the object. Or I don't know what you
Yeah.
mean. Yeah.
I think parody involves a kind of like really deep. I actually teach a class on parody as well, where my students write parodies. And one thing that we find uh, often is that um, a parody isn't just imitation. It's not a mimesis. It's involves a kind of like re- the only ones that are really good are really critique, and they're kind of like an imminent critique of what you're parodying, and you have to really get inside and inhabit the work, and then locate the the points at which it has the most kind of its internal contradictions start to appear to you, or in which you start to feel that there's something deeply wrong or deeply right about what's happening in the work. So I think in some ways, if you parody the epic, you're not necessarily kind of demoting the epic, you're actually kind of engaged in a kind of a deep reading of it. So that would be one way of thinking about it, I think.
That's fantastic. Now, one more question has popped up that I don't understand, but I'll just read it to you.
Okay.
Chicu, could you talk a bit about returning to this project after the first iteration? What is that like as a writer? Are you appreciative? I'm assuming that the question is about when you totally rewrote the book. What is that
Yeah.
like for a writer? Are you appreciative of the extra time, or are you sad you did it, or I don't know? What challenges does a full rewrite bring?
Yeah, well, I think that might refer to the fact that the book first appeared as a short 35-page chapbook um, that was in which the translation played a much smaller role, and in which I don't really talk too much about. I don't go quite as deeply into my illness and family life and professional life, because in some ways book is also an academic satire. Um, although um, I have a great relationship to my workplace, the character of the book doesn't. Um, so I think and so how does the book now relate to that earlier prototype? I think um, one thing I learned from expanding it so dramatically is how hard it is to tune back into where you were in your life years earlier. Um, and that actually may be part of why it took so long. It took 9 years to finish this book, but it really felt like a process of periodically returning and trying to really dial back into the particular mix of melancholy, rage, and dread that I was feeling when I wrote the original shorter version. Um, and maybe it's a good thing because I actually feel far away from those emotions now. But that did also make it harder to um, write the book. In the end, I also think that the progression beyond those states allowed the book to have a sense of progression away from those affects.
Can I give a tiny scholarly footnote?
Please.
Well, about the opening of Dante, you actually mistranslated it, and it's better than you realized because it's in the middle of our life.
Our life.
Nostra
Yeah.
Vita. It's all of our lives.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Not just life, it's Nostra Vita. So that
Yes.
just proves your point better than the translation you gave.
And it's
Well,
crucial.
yes. No, I was just thinking, well, that seems like a good place to end.
Yeah.
Now you have to go revise your book again. I don't know.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for coming and bearing with our technical difficulties. And um, I hope you all have a great rest of your summer. And thanks for being with me to launch this book.